Hey, welcome to Seth on Call. Today I'm going to be tackling a topic known as Archy, and exists within the Genesys Cloud world. Archy is actually an application that works command line, so we're going to be getting used to like a terminal view a little bit today, a little bit different. We'll still be using Architect. Archy is going to be kind of an export-import program command line for Genesys Architect flows. And I'm going to go talk about the export options within Genesys Architect so we can start to talk about what that then looks like for when we move things around. So why would you need to use Archy? I'm going to go over kind of the main reason and then maybe some other reasons you might still want to learn this application. But the number one reason you probably want to learn Archy as a Genesys Cloud admin is if you work for an organization or part of an organization which will use multiple org instances of Genesys Cloud. In other words, you might have like a dev environment, a prod, like a testing environment, and then a production. Those can exist within the same region, a region being really the overall data center that a lot of Genesys Cloud orgs are housed in. Sometimes two different orgs can exist for a company within the same region. Sometimes they may even build out a prod org within a separate region. Regions being a little bit more familiar with the naming convention of East 1 and West 2. And those are those regions which contain all these different orgs that Genesys Cloud kind of works in as an instance, if you will. So if that right up front is something that you might see yourself doing, is taking call flows, developing them in an org of Genesys Cloud that is your dev org, where just you and maybe a few others within maybe your department or even other, we'll say, kind of operations departments might build and then move into what would be a production org. Archy is definitely something that can help out in those scenarios as we try and keep those organizations really kind of level set all with the same configuration. Archy is a tool to be able to help with that. The other piece of that is just what I'm going to be going over today is using the command line tool really from that perspective of what we could eventually look at as a broader topic of CI/CD pipelines, you might be more familiar with in a DevOps world. This is where, just even from the perspective of maybe if we wanted to look at keeping just our flows backed up and just knowing when or what we kind of came from and all that, Genesys Architect does have a lot of version control within it. But again, some organizations like to be very particular with having most configuration code, all that kind of stuff sitting in repositories. So that way they are always standardized as far as a backup or reference point to be able to go back on within those repositories. And that's where Archy can help out as well. And using this export and then being able to use some of these commands that we would then take these files and put them into a repository so they can be stored there and we can see some file changes. And I'll talk more about the details in that. There can be still needs if you are using one org within Genesys Cloud. Maybe you've created a dev region, You've created a division within your org that you use for testing. Sometimes divisions can be used in that way. Divisions can still be, if you build out a call flow within a division that's just labeled as test or development, and then you publish it within a new division as a new example, so you can keep that separate, a workflow or even call flow that you've been building separately. It will still be able to reference a lot of the prompts and all of that. So in some ways it'll be a little bit easier to use Archy if you are within the same org, because you don't have to worry about as many prompt dependencies. We create the prompts in our staging environment like we needed them to be for when we were working within dev and then ultimately into production. So that will be another thing of where Archy may not necessarily be a need if you are a single org Genesys Cloud environment, but I still think that it's something useful to know if you are looking to get a little bit more Genesys Cloud admin and you want to start learning command line tools a little bit more just for your own knowledge use. For there is other topics I can get into later. I'm planning on eventually doing a video on Terraform and how Archy can or will be used actually in some of that as well, which is a big part of keeping everything uniform for not only just call flows, but also when we talk about queues and all of that, and really getting to a fully CI/CD pipeline type of flow, which can be worked towards with tools like Archy. That's the intro for right now. what I'm going to first do is take you to the Archy page. I'm going to talk through a little bit of the installation procedures, and then we'll get going with running a few of these commands, as well as me talking through a little bit of its setup process as well. With that, let's get started. Okay, so what I've got right here is brought up is the main Archy page here for within the Genesys Cloud Development Center website. So you're going to be going to developer.genesys.cloud, and then within this dev applications area over here in their resources pane, there is going to be this Archy topic as down here. So there's going to be quite a bit of information resource here within the site. We'll start here from the first part to just talk about what is Archy. So I'll have this up and displayed. Maybe I'll zoom in here a little bit for you just so you can see a little bit better. So yeah, what is Archy? So as this kind of first paragraph is talking about here, Archy is heavily using a kind of standardization of how when we export a flow, we can do it in a file format of YAML. And YAML is used in many different areas for kind of a large file basis for storing configuration, properties, all that kind of stuff in more of a human readable format. And then what we can do with Archy is take that YAML and actually publish it into a different org. And so really within a few of these actions, we should be up and running with everything that we had built in one org now existing in, say, a prod org by using these commands. So you might be curious right up front. I know there are export options already within Genesys Cloud. How is this going to be different that we need to really use this command line tool within this workflow that I'm going to be talking about? And the reason being is I'll go ahead and show it. So let's go ahead and hop over into Genesys Cloud Architect. I've got quite a few flows here. This is one I've been building out a little bit. We'll go into this creative menu flow here I did for a video where I was building out a large menu structure. And when we're in, I deleted this one. When we go into, we'll go into the second one that I've created here. When I'm in a flow like this, there's going to be a few different options up front. There's save as is really going to be within the user interface itself to save this one off as maybe a new name, something that I might build off of if I had wanted to do a very similar call flow to this, but then add in a lot more or redesign it. I could do that all within Genesys Architect. But again, this is going to be local to this org. There also then there's this drop down right here for export. We see two options. One is this .i3 inbound flow, and the other is YAML. Now, when we export this i3 file, I'm going to export it here, and we'll see where it pops it out here. Okay, so we'll go into my folders here, and then I'll see what this actually opens it up in. Okay, so I've just opened it up here in a text explorer, right? And all that we see is just what almost looks like a key here down here, and that's because this is a proprietary file, which if we open up in a text editor, it's just going to give us a junk output because there is no way to, like human form, read the text of this configuration file. So with that being said, it's something that we would then have to directly import then in within a web interface of Genesys Cloud. And that is possible. So if we go into create, we'll say add a new one, we'll just do test, and I will put this in my demo, create flow. There are ways of then importing in different ones. I think I have, underneath here, there is an import button here. So if I click this and I do a select, we'll notice that it really only had this i3 flow file as an option. So when we go to have an import button, it's only going to support this .i3 proprietary file. And so when we import this, then it will take over and take in all that logic, and then I'll have my naming that I did give this, but everything that I had in that original build comes over into this. So when we talk about if we were to then do this within a different org, right? If I took this .i3 file, should be able to just toss it in a prod environment and be good to go, right? Just like we've seen here. And it's not quite the way that it works. And that is because that .i3 file, even though we can't see the contents of it, most of what it's referencing, for instance, if we're doing like a transfer to sale, like right here, there's this transfer to marketing in this flow, and it gives us that drop down. It kind of has marketing already selected. That file is actually storing the ID information of this queue. So as we do see the name here, marketing, what actually gets stored in that file is a GUID ID of marketing to then import. So if we were to actually take this file over to a prod environment, and we did have a marketing queue over there, and we hit import on this, all of these transfer items are going to essentially break, or basically show as null until we go back and repoint all of them. And that's because when we import this .i3 file into another org, it's going to have a different ID for that queue. Even though we named it the same, ID is going to be different. And that's going to be the same for all of the other kind of object references that we're going to have in a file like this. So that's like data tables and maybe even data actions, queues, users. If we're doing like a direct to user transfer, or maybe even a direct to group transfer, all of those objects are going to have their own GUIDs referenced within that .i3 file that are going to break when we do an import. So if we really talk about it from the perspective of we're moving things into prod on a particular night, we only got a quick time window of when we need to get things done and then tested, that can really hurt, because you're going to have to go through and import all this in, and maybe it's a flow you worked on a couple weeks ago and we finally got our change window open. Trust me, I've been there. It's a lot to think back, oh gosh, what was this flow, and I have to reference it. So you got to really go back to your notes when importing a .i3 file into a new org, because you're going to have to really go there, especially if it's a very large call flow. You're going to have a lot of areas you're going to have to go back, hit the drop down list, point to the correct queue with that proper ID within that org. So it is possible to use these files when moving to a different org. It's very painful because of all those reconnects that have to be done. So that is the talk of when you do see the .i3 and why couldn't that be there. And just a quick import. The import only works on .i3, and .i3 files do not reference the correct ID information in a different org than the one that they were exported from. So that is where Archy starts to come along. Archy is going to be a command line tool that allows for us to essentially import a YAML file, which a YAML file is one where it's not going to be referencing IDs per se, not those GUIDs or anything. It is going to be a text-based format. So when we export a YAML file, we can do that right from the architect views. So I'll go back to my main views here and save as, or sorry, not save as. We would want to do the export here and export as YAML, and we could export the file. So we can do that and use this file then within our Archy program for a import function that we'll see in a little bit. However, really in using Archy, I have to exist over in that. What if I'm going to go command line? Let's go command line all the way. So I will actually get in the habit of using a command line function export function from Archy itself. It really does the exact same thing that I just did from the GUI, but just to keep things a little bit more uniform in my process, I will use an export of Archy, and when we talk about import, that will have to be done within Archy for it to then go through, basically take this text-based file and reference it correctly. So let's go ahead and look at an example. So over here, I've got one pulled up. I've got a couple of them pull up with different versions that I exported. So this is the main formatting that you might see within it. So up front, it's going to have the type of it, inbound call, the name of it, the division, and you're seeing already that everything being referenced here is all a text-based formatting. This system is all one that Genesys Cloud has come up with as far as how objects are going to be structured, and then all the properties, everything about what you're building out within an architect flow should be able to be represented in this YAML formatting. So it is interesting to go through, see how a lot of this is typed out when you do an export. If you really want to learn and do in-depth, there is the idea that you could essentially, and there is even some walkthroughs that I'll talk about on the developer side, you could start to open up their suggestion is to use Visual Studio Code in order to kind of have an extension help you in potentially even writing call flows from a YAML perspective. I'll talk a little bit about that later and kind of my thoughts there, but in theory, that is an idea that you could. Mostly what I'm going to be talking about today and what I'm going to be going through and we actually use it is more so from the perspective of exporting, importing into a new org, not necessarily from the idea of like how would we develop call flow, all while using a YAML type of writing style. So today I'm really just going to be showing through the installation of Archy, the setup. We'll talk through what I mentioned earlier. It was like the export, even though you could do that step through the GUI, and then what an import is going to look like. So let's talk about installation. I'll head back over here and we'll go through what that's going to be. Okay, so we've talked about what Archy is, command line tool. Specifically, we're going to be using it with the YAML file types of architect that we're going to export and then import. So to talk about installation, there's going to be a few different types for Windows, Linux, and Mac. The Linux and Mac one is going to be a very similar installation instructions, but main idea is we're really just getting a kind of zipped up file from their site. The download is available. I'll point that out. And then we're going to be unzipping it into a folder, checking to make sure we can run it. And then we're going to go through a little setup piece of it, and then we'll be ready to go with it. All right. We've got right now the Archy kind of installation page here we're going into. So let's talk about that Archy install. So when I go to this installation page here, there is a couple of different links and with the instructions here. If you have Windows, like I mentioned, same kind of thing. It'll have you go ahead and create a folder that you would then take this zip file here. You can kind of see it even referenced in the bottom of my screen. Going to be an Archy-win zip file. And then they suggest putting it within your user directory underneath just an Archy folder. And so there's a couple of command line level instructions there where you can just create the folder there. Then once you're done unzipping that within Windows, you should see the .bat file as well as an Archy bin file. And then as we go through the setup process, that will create another folder in there called Archy Home, which will be really important too when we export information. One thing that I'll mention is it is helpful that once you do get this installed to go ahead and put the path file in there. So there's some instructions about that. If you're familiar within Windows, you can go to edit your environment variables, put it in either the system or user. It worked fine for me on my Windows machine when I was using it to put it with just that path file for Archy in my user environment variables within that path variable. So there are other instructions too online for managing that field within your environment variables. Would definitely suggest that way you don't always have to like go to that folder and do the proper referencing of the bat file. You can just type in Archy. You can then start using commands, and that is the way to do it. So right now I'm operating on a Linux machine, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that process, and then that's what we'll see that I'll be able to show here. Same kind of process when we are installing things within a Linux or even macOS. We're really just going to be creating a folder where we can then unzip these. I'm going to scroll down to really the Linux piece down here just to talk about what I did here. Okay, that's the Mac one. Let me scroll up a little bit more. Okay. So yeah, what I had done is within my main directory under my user, just created the Archy one. And then I used this unzip command, so where I downloaded it, and then just to the directory of Archy. And then as I unzipped it, have that Archy structure as well. So we can take a look at that. All right, let me hop over. Okay. So let me clear this is the results of one of my previous ones. I believe I am in my main folder. So if I do a list, yeah, so I've got a folder in here called Archy. So let's go ahead and take a look in there. Okay. As I mentioned, you should see I've got a couple extra files in here, but you should at least see a Archy program. And then for right now, you'll just probably see that Archy bin folder. You should be good for right now. One of the main ways you can really check is to go ahead and like I mentioned, the path is also another thing I would suggest changing within your environment, whether it's Linux or Windows. For me, I think I went through these steps as well, which was to edit what basically is a path reference as well within, my bash profile. I went through these steps as well, so that way my bash terminal would be able to reference it. So that way my export path and then Archy being that path would be referenced. So definitely suggest doing that. So that way when I'm anywhere, or if I'm maybe just even at my home directory, I can type Archy and then version. So that's what we want to type right up front, just to make sure we've got it unzipped correctly. Definitely would suggest that first. Let me clear my screen just so you can see it one more time. I'm going to type in Archy version. And then as long as you see some sort of result there, you're good. If you do see like Archy's not a recognized command, maybe try troubleshooting how you put that path reference in place, or you can even go ahead and move into the Archy folder, and then depending on your OS and how you might reference files, I think you can do like a /Archy, and I think that should do it as well. Yeah. So there are ways you can't even get directly. So if you couldn't even edit your path variables, you might just have a little bit more you might have to type just to reference the file when you're in that folder location itself. Okay, cool. Now that we've got it installed and we've typed our fun little Archy version command, we see it's there. This is the current version I'm on, 2.36. We're now ready to set up an account within Genesys Cloud that we'll use. Within some of my videos on data actions and even talking about Postman and using it, I went through the process of setting up an OAuth account within Genesys Cloud. And that's what we want to do within. It's really the same process for setting up Archy access as well. And you can really even use the same account that you might be using for some development. So the other day I used this Seth one for some builds that I was doing within Archy or other API access needs that I had for development into the org. So it's the same thing. You'd want to go through, and we kind of went through this in a couple of videos, but go ahead and give it a name. You might even name it like Archy account. And then you'd say client credentials, next, and then you'd want to pick a role. And I'm going to talk about the role here next. And so you'd pick the role, and then it'll give you your client ID and then your client secret. So keep both of those, keep those saved, because that's what you'll use to then set up your profile. So I'm going to cancel this, but what I am going to go back to is show the roles. And I set up one called Archy, and let's talk about what we might need in here. So again, this is me setting up a role that will be used to assign to that OAuth account. And so that way I can control, even though it's really going to be me using it for development purposes and I'm an admin, I still want to just somewhat keep it locked down. So in that permission structure, I went through and typed in arc. And the main ones are going to be under flow. And so I went ahead and added all those. You could just select all permissions, but I want to show each of them labeled out here. This can be relevant because obviously Archy is going to need to add. It's one of the most basic things. Also, as well as publishing, and some of the other ones you may need in the future with more complex Archy commands you might want to run. For instance, if you are starting to use some of their ones for recreating a flow, it would need to remove a flow and then add it. So I would suggest adding most of those in there. That can be really helpful for moving forward. So that's one where I would suggest a little bit more general across the board is really for those architect flow type permissions. Then a lot of other ones, I'll just go ahead and show them what I've done, the assigned permissions, being able to view data tables, because Archy is going to need to pull that list and make sure they exist, because it will be doing some error checking as it does run through its publishing steps. So we did the architect flow ones, milestones, outcome, grammar, system prompts, as well as user prompts as well. And then also this architect by view one is important. Be sure to add that one as well. And then some of these other routing ones for queue, skill, and wrap-up code. Those are the ones that I found just for my flows. There could even be other ones in case you are using maybe some objects that aren't as common in your flows. There could be some system objects you still need to add in here, but this was working for me to at least get some basic flows published. So I would recommend a list similar to this, and then add in as you need to some of these other permissions that would be on this account that you're going to be using within Archy. So that's the role. We want to make sure this role gets assigned to not only me as an admin, because that's how I'm able to then assign it to an OAuth account. So that can be tricky sometimes to remember that. But once you get there, go ahead and assign this Archy role, or whatever you want to name this role, to then that OAuth OAuth account that you'll be using within setting up Archy. So we've got this role set up. It's got the permissions we're going to need for at least getting some things published within the Genesys Cloud org. So we've got that set. Let's go ahead and move back to my terminal here. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to run through the setup process. So we've got our account. We saved off those client ID and client secret. And I'm going to go ahead and do Archy setup. Okay, it's going to give us this fun little screen. It'll say enter to continue, enter to continue. Okay, so it's just letting you know, again, what I've been mentioning. We want to make sure we have those client credentials ready to go. So I'm going to say, yeah, so it's confirming that. I'm going to say yes to keep going. This is the step where it's going to create that home directory. If you want a different one, you can. I had no problem with just making a directory. Basically, this is where it's going to export things. Look, or when we're pulling in things by default, this would just create that within that Archy home. I'm fine with that. So we're good there. This is where you're going to need to set up your region. For me, I operate within the US West region. Potentially could be in one of the other ones, especially if your org is an international org. So I would suggest just verifying which region you should be in. That's usually pretty well known just based on what addressing you have to go to in your URL at the top of your browser when you're in your UI instance of Genesys Cloud. So usually this string is going to be very similar to what's in your URL. Okay, so us w2.pure.cloud. I'm going to just go ahead and hit that. And next we have here, what am I looking at? Oh, the debug mode. Okay, so debug mode, I would suggest leaving this at false for your kind of default configuration. This is basically providing a lot more details when Archy does go through its publishing commands and all that, giving you step by step what it's doing. So if you do need to troubleshoot things and you can't quite figure out why Archy isn't able to complete one of its tasks, I would suggest using the debug flag at the time in which you need to do that. I never really like it being on by default, so I'm going to leave it as false. But that's okay. If I ever need to turn on the debug mode later on, I can just add it as a flagged option when I run my command. So if you're familiar with command line, there's always these kind of flags you may be required to give or optional to give. Debug is an optional one. So that way if we did want to enable debugging, we could say --debug true, and we'll get those extra lines of logging in our output. So I'm going to leave it as default, as false. Okay. And then this is where we would put in a client ID. Okay, now the client ID is going to be what I mentioned earlier as the ID string that we're given it. You can even go back and reference that. Your client secret is not going to be there anymore, so hopefully you grabbed it. Otherwise, you'll need to generate a new one in that OAuth area of Genesys Cloud. I'm not going to set anything here for now, but this is where I would suggest to go ahead and put in that client ID and then the client secret. So go ahead and put in there what you have noted in your notepad as the client secret. If you forgot it already or accidentally didn't save it, you'd have to go back to that OAuth account and regenerate a new key. So don't do that if you're using that account for other things in production. Make sure you've got everything stored off and handled well when you store your client ID and client secret. This is what I'm going to be using. This is the auth token. So if you actually had a token, usually tokens are going to expire after a certain amount of time. You could use a client ID and client secret to grab an auth token. They are going to be more of a temporary thing. That's what I'll be using just because I will be using my authentication on a temporary basis for this. But if you wanted to, you could use the auth token. I would suggest if you are day in, day out, it's your work laptop, all that kind of stuff, go ahead and just use the client ID and client secret. But if you're needing to do things in a kind of a temporary manner like I am, you could use the auth token, which is going to be the much larger or longer string that's already past that gathering of a token. I'm going to leave that blank for now, and I'll use my own tag for this. Okay. Create stubs. I have not used this. I believe this is like a additional storage information for files. If you need this, you can turn it. I haven't needed it, but I just leave this at false, but it could be something that you might need in the future. Okay, this is important as well. So this last step is going to be a refresh. What that means when we first install Archy, it really wants to be able to create a local cache of everything within your org. So referencing what those IDs are going to be for your queues, many of the other objects that Archy might need to reference when importing. So it's going to run based off of the credentials that you've given it in the region, which will pull for that org. I've done this before. I think it's a good thing to do, so that way you are kept up with the most live data, especially if you run into issues in the future and Flow is not publishing correctly and you're sure that you've already uploaded the prompts and everything correctly. And what I will say is just prepare yourself when you first run this. This refresh is going to take a while because it has to basically go and run all these get commands on all of the stuff in your system. So if you do have a really large org and you've already got tons of prompts collected or prompts created, tons of queues, all that kind of stuff, this action right here will take a long time. You may want to, if you do want to kind of get that initial base of schemas in there so that Archy can reference it for more accurate publishing in the future, which I would suggest, be sure to give yourself some time for this to run. You could say yes, it will use your client credentials to then log in, and within this Archy home schemas directly start creating all of those objects as a reference point for Archy to use. So I'm not going to do it right now. I'm just going to leave as is. So I'm going to say no, but I would suggest going through that when you have the time to do. If you don't have the time right now and you want to get going, you can just say no to this and then run your own Archy refresh command later when you do have time, and it will go through and create that later. So we don't, it's not a now or never thing. So I'm going to say no, and then we're done. So now it's created a little file within your directory to then, you can see it there. It's within my folder, that .archy_config. So if you want to go in there and edit some of that information directly, you can, or rerun this Archy setup wizard to go back and update those details if you want to. We'll say that I put in the client information and ID stuff that we needed. And so we're good to go from authentication standpoint, and we're good to start thinking about what we're going to actually use Archy for. So I'm going to go ahead and clear this screen for right now. Okay, and I'm going to run an Archy export, and then we're going to do a little help here. So at any time you have questions, you can do a little help command after either export or publish. So I'm going to run this one for right now. So what we've got here is a long list of these flags that we can use within our command line options for Archy. So right now it's giving us the Archy export command and everything we can do. So this is the one I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using the auth token, so that way I can pass along an already token that's going to be expiring shortly. If you wanted to, you could even pass in the client ID and secret altogether. I wouldn't suggest that. Then there's that debug flag that I talked about earlier, where you could then go ahead and enable that with a true to go ahead and see line by line if you needed to. Export file name. This is optional. What it's going to do is just default to the file name of the flow with a little bit of version information on there. Export type. This is going to be important. We can go ahead and export as that, it will by default do that .i3 file with the export flag. And that's where usually like I mentioned, I go through a process where I do the export myself with command line versus doing it in the user interface, which you could do since YAML is an export option there. I just go ahead and use this flag to switch it to YAML, so that way it won't be defaulting to that. So that is one of the optional ones that I do use, is the export type. I will be using that and then setting it to YAML here as it has suggested. Flow ID, don't use too much. Flow name is important. That is going to be what it needs to reference for pulling what flow you want. And then flow type. This is also needed as well when exporting. Once we export a YAML file, it will then have within it, whether it's an inbound call flow or anything like that. So when we go to then import, we don't actually need to set a flow type flag, but for export we do, because the export function needs to know where to go look. There could be in a lot of different areas of Genesys Cloud. So flow name, flow type are going to be very important. So we'll need both of those to go in and find either and we're going to be using inbound call today. I'm not going to do any other type. So inbound call is going to be important there. So far we're going to have our export type being YAML. We're going to set the name of the flow, and then we're also going to do inbound call for the flow type. If you want to choose a different version, you could. Force is basically so that way you can overwrite if you already had done this before, and the file name is going to be the same because it's the same version. Help, which we've just run. Location if you needed to change that, but we're going to be defaulting to our config file, so we should be good there. Options file, I would suggest this as you do get a little bit more advanced with it, and you are going to then publish in a cloud or in a production environment, right? I usually keep the setup process we just did and where the defaults are of my client ID and client secret being the ones that are for my dev org. And then I create an options file with a similar format. You can basically keep the same formatting as that Archy_config file that we referenced when we hit the setup. Create your own, name it whatever, maybe prod, and then use this flag to reference those login options rather than your dev ones. That way you can just throw that on there as an easy reference point when publishing in your production. So I'm only going to have one org to work with today, so I won't be using that in the examples I give, but would definitely suggest that for the majority of you who would be using Archy, because your scenario is going to be publishing in prod or a staging environment. So definitely get your options file ready to go as something that you can reference when you do run commands for prod. Okay, a different outbound directory if you want to not use your Archy home, and then overriding results file and results file, just some other information. Basically went over the main ones for right now. So we've talked about the export and what we're going to run. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be switching a little bit here and there with the blur screen just because I need to generate those auth tokens. So hopefully eyes won't be strained too much as I hop around here a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to hop over into my blur mode for real quick and generate those, and then we'll be good to go back. All right, I've got it in here. And right now I've grabbed my auth token and saving it. I'm going to clear this screen. And I'm hopping over to my notes file to basically just put this as for my reference. And all right, I think I did it right. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna copy the first part, and then I will show that, and then I'll come back and run it, and then we'll see what it looks like. Okay. Okay, let's flip over to the main screen here. Okay, so right now what I've typed up is an export command. So again, we could do this in the user interface, but I like to just get used to using my command line. I'm going to do Archy export, so that's going to be our main one. Like I mentioned, I use the export type being YAML. It's in this one word, you don't necessarily need to put it in the quotes, but more proper way of doing it would be putting in quotes. But flow type, inbound call, same thing. These are the two like really neat ones that are going to be the same for me pretty much all the time. And then flow name is what changes. I'm going to use the one I had a little bit ago, the creative menu flow I did for another video. So here are the main important ones that I'm going to use. And so I could run this right now if I had my client credentials stored away in that setup file. I do not, so I'm going to use an auth token. So I'm going to hop back over into my blur screen, and then I'll come back, run it, and then show the output. Okay, so I'm going to go grab that info and copy, paste. Okay, it's running away, so I can go ahead and show. Okay, so I already have this file already created because I exported it later, but basically what I want to show up front is just what we should see up front. So we've got some information about the directory will be up there. I'm not going to scroll up too much more because my token's going to be up there. So then we're going to go middle start, give some information about what it's looking up, and then I have an error because of the fact that this file already exists. What else do I have down here? Just some summary information about it, and then the exit code. So what I'm going to do is hop over here, and then I'm going to change up this name. I believe I can do that from here. I might be able to. Let's see. Oh, maybe not. Yeah, what we'll do is I'm just going to force it so it'll override this file. We'll do that. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go back to my blur screen. I'm going to rerun it, and I'm just going to run it with the force command. so we can see the output. So I'm doing a force. Okay, we're clear. So now it's running and it finished its export. So I forced it, so we just overwrite that creative menu flow. So we'll see the version information. It tells you where it exported the file. So I'm still just like in my home directory, so that's all good for me. It does give a flow ID and then just what version it was. And I didn't put anything, so I just went with the latest and then complete. And so this time we didn't have any errors. So we saw what happened with an error, just some red lettering text there. Sometimes it's a little cryptic to just see it up front as one big blob of red. But if you read through it, a lot of times it will give you pretty pointed information about what went wrong and then how to remediate that. So we've exported it. It's now sitting in our directory here. So I'm going to start to then write together a publish for this call flow. Okay. So with that being said, I'm going to need to go get another token. So I'm going to clear for right now, and we'll do a clear, and we'll run my app to get that token. And over here, I'm going to paste that in. Okay. It's ready to go. So I'm going to show you the command I'm going to run without that information up front. Okay. Okay, let's see what we got here. Okay, so I'm going to run an Archy publish. And this time, all I really need to give it is, as far as what I need outside of authentication, is going to be the file name. And really, I could run this if I had my client credentials all stored, because within this file, it already knows information such as what the type of file it is, all that jazz. I'm going to go back to my screen here, and then I'm going to paste in my authentication, and I'll run it, and we'll see what happens. And paste. Okay, it's running away. So it's going to run through all these tasks, and this is where it goes through each of those YAML statements and then does its own referencing of that to information about your system that you're going to be moving into. So we see play audio steps, all of that, and it's successfully done it. So it says command publish, the flow, URL, all that kind of information. I'll scroll up a little bit just to show it. Again, this flow isn't necessarily massive, so we were able to get through it pretty quickly. Other flows might take a little bit, but as we look through it, we can see all that naming information. That's because it's trying to process it. It's taking names like the menu, or sorry, like a queue name, and trying to find the IDs for it. So it's doing all of that as it goes through and does this publish. And this is really the kind of the bread and butter of Archy, is this publish command, being able to run through and gather all this information and then put it together. So yeah, that is really what our main goal was, is to get something published. Now, this is a happy path. Let's say we were publishing this into a different org and something isn't quite there. We thought we noted everything, all the queues we needed and all the queue names and all the prompts, but we missed one. So let's see what that looks like, and that's where I can help. I gotta direct you as you would. You need to read through and parse through maybe what went wrong with an export, because as you have a large flow, it's bound to happen. Eventually, you're going to miss at least one object. So what I'll do is I'm going to go over to my flows here, and I'm going to go reference within Architect the prompts. And I believe one of the ones I was using in here, if I remember right, if I go to the main menu, maybe it was in my main task up here. Oh, maybe not. Okay. Yeah. Let me see if I reference any prompts in here. Voicemail, greeting, transfer voicemail. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to one of these other flows and we'll publish it, one that I had earlier. So One that I had earlier was this. Actually, let's do it. Just that way you can follow along with me as I do this within one flow. Let me go to this create a menu flow here. And up front in this main task, I'm going to edit this. I'm going to put in a play audio step here. And the audio I'm going to use, let's do prompt, and then I'm going to add it directly. So I'm going to do, let's do one of the welcome ones. Okay, so there is a customer service welcome one. I'm going to put that in there and reference it. So I'm going to save this and publish. And then I'm going to go back and run that same export command that I did earlier. So I'm going to just run over to my terminal real quick and do that. So that way we have a new one. So I'm going to need to gather my token real quick. Save this guy off. And I'm going to go ahead and use the force flag to force the overwrite of the other file. So we're going to do -- force. And copy. And copy. All right, bear with me here. And we're exporting that creative flow. It is going to complete, maybe. Okay. Yeah, and I didn't use the force flag because it increased the version to version 3. And so because of that, I'm actually going to show right here. Now it's showing as a version 3. So it was a new file because I made that change for the play file. So we're good there. Now I'm going to want to run the publish command with this version. So version 3, because there's going to be a reference there of a play audio step. But what I'm going to do before, so I've already exported it. It's in version 3 as this customer service _ welcome. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go over into, before I publish, let's go over into, oh, I was already over here, this user prompt. So I'm going to go to this user prompt. I'm going to just switch the name of it. So we're going to say customer service welcome 2. So I'm going to change the name, say OK. And then I want to go ahead and get my publish command ready to go, and we'll see what happens with the fact that now this version 3 is referencing in text form. And I can even show that over here. So let's go over and open up this YAML. That's probably going to be pretty close to the beginning, I would think. But it could not, maybe not. It's in here. Okay, there it is right there. So one of the main tasks here, there's a play audio right here, and it's prompt customer service _ welcome. So this text is what Archy uses to go find that prompt and reference it, but we've changed it now. No longer is it customer service _ welcome, it's welcome 2. So let's see what happens. Okay. I'm going to get my authentication token set up, ready to go. And we're going to do a new one here just to get the fresh one. And copy. And replacing the token. Archy publish. It's going to be I'm going to change up the version. We're going to change it to 3 now. And copying this. And I'll start sharing again once the command is running. And okay. It's running now. We're trying to run the flow. And we have an error. So let's look at this. it was going through just fine, running a lot of different checks, going through the different tasks that it needed to, getting most of that done with all those menus. But then what happened was, towards the validation results here, again, it can be a little cryptic, but if you start to read into details, you'll eventually see, okay, name play audio. So it was a play audio step. And the variable reference for prompt.customerservice_welcome is not valid. So Archy went into the system, tried to find that prompt, and it is no longer there. And that's just because we renamed it. So again, showing how this type of import off YAML is not going to be referencing any of the ideas, which is good, because we'd have to redo all of that when moving to a different org, because all those IDs are going to be different. But in this scenario, where maybe we change the name or a prompt doesn't exist there yet, we're gonna receive this error because that prompt is not actually there. So it is helpful, and sometimes when you're uploading a large flow and there's quite a few prompts that are misplaced or not quite there yet, there can be quite a bit to go through, but you can keep going, right? Like, I just move up, fix that prompt or a few prompts as much as I think, and then hit up again, run it again, and then it'll be like, you're still missing this. So I eventually kind of work my way through it if it's a large flow and we just didn't quite get a few things over into prod that we needed to. But hopefully with good notes, we had already moved everything. We won't get one of these type of error messages to display. But that is the main idea. What we'd want to be using Archy for is to pull in these flows. So we've gone through the export and the publish. And so a lot of times that's what I will use then to get a lot of these files that we kind of reference over here into a prod environment, and we can do it because of the system that is within YAML. That is the main piece of and meat of what I wanted to show today. I'm going to go over a few other topics as it relates to Archy, just for a little bit more explanation, but hopefully that is like at least something that helps you out in getting through a few ways of really streamlining how you're going to move things from different orgs within your environment, especially as you're building out a big flow in dev and moving it into prod. That export and then import should allow you to do that without having to worry about changing up all those IDs like you would have if you just used the user interface with those .i3 files. Cool. All right, with that, I'm going to go over and talk about a few other areas that are in the Archy. Cool. Okay, so we already went through the installation. We already talked about actually publishing it, so we saw most of it. The other things I want to talk about is some of the other ways that Archy could be used. There's talk here about using it within coder editors. I mentioned this a little bit ago, and how you can have Archy start to type out like how you'd want to actually write a flow using YAML. This can be very tricky because if you really are wanting to either take a flow that you're already using and you have multiple teams working on, and then maybe add in just one piece, maybe like a new menu into a flow, it can be tricky because if we go back and we look at especially this creative menu flow here, I had a menu and a reference of it going to different parts of the flow and tasks. And down here you'll see where these referencing areas have numbers on them, 24, and that is really going to be a task that I have at the end. But again, these task numbers, as they kind of get appended on here, may change when you do publishes. And we can see that within some of my different views. So as I've gone through some of these flows and I might publish a new version or something like that, there can be some of these numberings off to the side can change. So it's referencing this 24, but if I had built this out or another team had and put it into prod, it may not always be that number. And that could just be how Architect would have built. You can do basically like a recreate, which would pull down and delete the flow and recreate it, and based on that YAML give a similar idea to how that referencing could work. That might work as well. Just be very careful if you do start to try and actually take a flow that's already built and add in pieces that you might just think are a copy paste of a new task or a new menu. Definitely make sure you really dot your I's and cross your T's when doing that, because there is these referencing of these kind of action item numbers, and they might be different in between your different organizations or your different orgs of Genesys Cloud. So definitely look out for that. That's why I usually suggest it's a good way of taking what is in dev, and just publishing that into prod. But if you have multiple teams and maybe they edited that dev flow and added in an object that doesn't need to go yet, that can be really tricky. Definitely work with your teams on how you would be implementing Archy, and especially if you have larger flows that multiple individuals or teams would be working on. There's a huge caveat there that you'd want to really make sure that information is there. And that's another reason why I do say if you're uploading these to a repository and you have different downloads of your creative menu flow from dev and from prod, when you do a compare of the files, you can get a lot of red lines saying that they're different when even the logic is all the same, because those IDs will be different, and so thus it will see it as different like code in the different files. So not always a one-to-one thing as far as like when we think about a traditional like CI/CD pipeline, but can work towards that with different processed ways in which you're going to be moving these flows from dev into a prod org. So would definitely make sure you lay that all out with your teams that would be creating flows. And that, again, that's going to be for a pretty large organization that's going to have to deal with that. But just wanted to give that caveat as well. The other thing that I want to talk about with Archy that's just a little strange to me, but I think it's just the way it works, is sometimes when you do publish flows, it will reference audio files and different things as expressions rather than the actual prompt reference. I've seen this when moving flows. It's just a weird way that when you do import a new flow, it might be referenced. Just look out for that. Sometimes it just happens within a play audio step. You'll look at it and it's just like a little different of a look as it does the referencing. But hey, not a huge deal. Just sometimes you might see things that are, when they're published by Archy, that have a little bit of a different look, but the referencing is still the same. Just want to give that caveat when you're publishing things into a prod environment. You might start to look at some objects and wait a minute, why is it an expression? Why is it not the direct prompt? That's one thing that I found, not a huge deal, just something to look out for and not have you give like a heart attack of like things got changed when it will do those expressions a little differently. Okay, so that's one thing. Just sometimes the views are a little different with expressions as they get moved over. The other thing I want to talk about is when you do look at the versioning, and in prod, one of your teams may have done things manually versus using Archy. That is in the version. So in the version control, you can see here where I had done a publish here where it is my OAuth client of Seth on call rather than my user. So you will see a little difference when using OAuth, essentially meaning you're doing probably an Archy publish of that information. In the version control, it'll say OAuth client versus maybe what you're using as your typical user. So that's just something to see as well when you're going back and looking at that version control within Architect. You can see when that may have happened. So that helps quite a bit as well for some of the referencing of Archy. With that being said, and that's at least some of the details. I went over a lot of the main pieces of setting up those accounts for Archy. Other things that are to look out for, like I mentioned, use that -debug flag when needed if you see Archy just still not quite publishing a flow in the way you would expect it to. Always make sure to just kind of check your object references. Be sure to do an Archy refresh for your schemas too. That can help if you're having some issues. And that really is most of what I want to go over. Main idea of installing it, running it, a export as well as a publish, a few of the other commands and just flags that I talked about, as well as how you might need to set up the permissions for that OAuth account, and then just the little caveats. Other than that's pretty much it. I'll do a video in the future about how then Archy even ties into Terraform, and really how we can kind of look at a full CI/CD pipeline for queues and all that. It will involve even those references of where we could even really run command line Terraform and have it to where a whole bunch of queues get created, maybe even the wrap-up codes we need, as well as then the publishing of a new flow, and all of that can happen in a pretty streamlined manner. And that's some really cool stuff. You really have to kind of plan for that, really make sure all the objects you'll need and all of that moving forward. But once you get there, it's very nice to have, as you do have that uniformity of getting things into a production environment. So I hope that helped. If at least maybe you might be in a position where your organization would want to use this to move call flows around within your orgs or different regions. Hopefully at least shine some light on how to do it. I know it can be a little daunting. If you have any comments or even suggestions or other ways that you used Archy, feel free to leave those below in the comments. And if anything, it at least gave you a little fun confidence in using command line. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. And then, as always, thanks for being on call with me.